Is your quality management system fit for purpose? What begins to happen is the ability to tailor to something specific calls into question your quality management system when really it shouldn't. The system probably is fine as it is. What is your vendor management paradigm? Does that mean that vendor management wasn't something that should have been done 20 years ago? No, it should have always been done 20 years ago. The idea is, do I need to have a bit more control? Do I need to have a bit more flexibility? Do I need to be able to adapt to whatever is actually happening? I'm going to answer all of those questions as yes, and then there's some other variables like maybe.
This is Trial and Error, where we dive deep into the world of clinical trials, uncovering the challenges, breakthroughs, and stories behind the scenes. Clinical trials are the backbone of advancing medical care, yet the administrative hurdles of getting sites started up and getting patients through the door often slows down progress.
Today's guest is Sherita Hall. Sherita currently serves as the Vice President of Clinical Operations for an early clinical stage ophthalmology biotech, where she leads a fully insourced team for her organization's phase 1 and 2 studies. Sherita has long been a leader in clinical operations for the past decade. Like many great leaders, she developed her extensive clinical expertise cutting her teeth as a CRA across pharma, med device, and biotech, where she learned what separates good from great and what it means to run effective clinical monitoring programs at scale. Sherita also operates her own clinical outsourcing business under PACT CTO, where she helps fellow ClinOps leaders identify and train internal teams to be effective within small teams, navigate complex problems, and work under resource-constrained environments. With that, I welcome Sherita Hall, who will be discussing with me across several episodes how she took her team from FSO to Insourced and the various challenges and opportunities along the way.
The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
All right. Glad to have you on. Hello, Sherita.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for coming on. So just for context for bringing you on here, I think one of the things I hear about a lot is, resource management. And I think if you're kind of looking at Clinical Leader or any of these other publications, I think there's a general question about how this trend from kind of full service outsourcing to FSP to insourcing is progressing in the industry. I know it's a question that a lot of clinical operations leaders have as it relates to kind of either reducing trial costs or improving quality. And it's pretty unusual, I would say, for a smaller organization such as the ones that you've worked with in the past and present to kind of undertake this journey. So I really wanted to have you on to talk about that. So without further ado, super excited to ask you some questions around that. I guess the company you're working with right now, you recently decided to kind of more or less fully insource your study. And from what I understand, that's pretty unusual for a smaller end biotech. Is that correct?
For the most part, I think that's correct. A lot of times, smaller biotechs want to be able to leverage resources. And the easiest way to leverage resources is to be working with a CRO because you know that they have access to multiple personnel across different functions. Though if someone were to leave, they can easily identify someone to replace them. When you decide to take on the operations yourself, that now means that you have this risk of having a team member maybe move on because there's just opportunity they cannot let pass them by, or maybe they need to promote. Like they've really shown that they've developed and they're going to be leaving a gap. When you're smaller, you try to keep your operating budget, I should say, to a very controlled state. And you don't want to have a lot of variability. So having someone leave now means you have to use dollars to recruit. And it puts you really in this status of not knowing if you're going to have that same quality of candidate. There's just more variables that come into play with doing it yourself. And so it can be a lot easier to rely on a partner.
Interesting move, starting with the risks. Well, presumably there are some rewards, or at least there's a good reason to do so, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what would those be?
So if you think in terms of the rewards, if you need to have more control, let's say you have a particular product, and the product might have a shorter shelf life. And if the product has a shorter shelf life, it means you may be manufacturing on demand. So in a manufacturing model, you want to make sure that you're able to not waste any of your product when it's manufactured. Therefore, you need to have more control of what's happening with the sites. But relating that specifically to what's happening from a manufacturing perspective. So if manufacturing is driving everything, then that needs to be pretty much how the operations are set up. They need to be set up around that particular driver. That then means that you might need to be flexible. You might need to be adaptable. And oftentimes, if you're working in an environment that has well-established procedures, those procedures sometimes don't allow for the flexibility. So you can get a lot of control by doing it yourself and being able to write procedures that really are specific to the operations you need to conduct instead of broad enough to cover a variety of operations that a company may have at the same time across their various studies.
Got it. That makes sense. If I'm understanding this, yes, it is riskier. So let's not pretend that it's not. However, when you choose to kind of go with this model, one of the biggest benefits is control. And you need control, especially when you have a manufacturing driven study. Is that how to think about it?
That's one reason that you may need more control. It could be the complexity of the study design itself
Hmm.
requires that you have a bit more control, but with control, also this element of needing to be flexible and adaptable. And for instance, in my background on rare disease studies, one of the things that you have to do is identify those patients wherever they may be.
Hmm.
So instead of saying we're going to go into these geographies, and so we need to find sites in these geographies because they connect well with our manufacturing depot, we need to figure out where these patients are. And so if they're anywhere in the world, now I need to actually figure out a way to transport the patients to a center that's close enough to them. And you may need to have some flexibility in your windows around your visits. And so there could be a myriad number of reasons to look at the doing it yourself, if you will, or maybe a hybrid, some functional service providers helping you and then building the infrastructure internally. The idea is, do I need to have a bit more control? Do I need to have a bit more flexibility? Do I need to be able to adapt to whatever is actually happening? I'm going to answer all of those questions as yes. And then there's some other variables like maybe on-demand manufacturing. It might really push you into the direction of maybe you need to consider setting it up for yourself and figuring out what that would look like going forward.
Sounds like flexibility and control are perhaps like the biggest two considerations. Or are there other major considerations that one might have?
So depending on the size of the trial, it could be going to a partner company, say full service outsourcing, could be too expensive. So you might not be able to afford it. So when I worked for smaller medical device companies, we often couldn't find a partner, not because I don't think they didn't have medical device experience, but it was really tough for us to compete with some of the larger companies that were going to bring in much more business.
Hmm.
And I know that some of the larger partners, the CRO partners in particular, have established like biotech portions of their company to meet the needs. But at the end of the day, it may just make more fiscal sense for a company to figure out how to bring in a smaller staff and have that smaller staff just execute the trial, especially if there's the potential that you're looking to get acquired after you do maybe a feasibility and a pivotal study. You can proceed to a quick acquisition. There's some business reasons as well. I don't tend to know as much about the business reasons. I am in operations, but I do know those exist.
Got it. I think one of the things I often hear about when people have this conversation about whether or not to take in certain components of the study themselves is just the sheer cost of infrastructure. I think that often feels like a very daunting task. Is there anything you can say about setting up the internal infrastructure that people should be aware of? And perhaps are the costs maybe higher in theory than they are in practice, or maybe that there's a kind of approach that you take where it doesn't seem as daunting of a task?
Absolutely. I think when you're thinking about the infrastructure, let's start off with computer systems. Oftentimes, if you go with the most used computer system, it requires a programming team. So now you actually have to have a team with a background, a specialized background, and you have to keep them on staff to help you with that tool. What I have found over the last 10 years, and really it was before 10 years, but in the last 10 years, I've seen true adoption is there are systems that are available where you don't really have to have a programming background. You just need to understand what's required and then be able to follow wizards to configure it.
Hmm.
So in those cases, now things that would have been very difficult to do previously because you would have needed to staff your company to handle the programming, then handle the administration. So assist admin, you would need that role. All of these things melt away. And now you could have someone like me that doesn't have an actual IT background, doesn't have a coding background, but understands what's required and can follow a wizard could actually help to configure a tool. With the advent of these tools that put the configuration in the hands of less trained and skilled technical individuals, it enables you now to keep the cost down as well, because oftentimes those tools don't come at as high of a price tag either. So you can find potentially an electronic data capture system, a clinical trial management system, even an interactive response technology system that could be configured. And because of that, looking at that price tag that we all were familiar with years ago, we could actually see, wait a second, this can be done in an affordable way and within more of what I call a shoestring budget to help the company get to a particular state, right? Where maybe then they'll have a partner or someone larger that could help bring them to the next stage of development of their product.
Got it. So at least when we're talking about infrastructure from a systems perspective and the other software that you might adopt as part of your study, one of the things that you recommend is if you're working on a smaller budget, there are probably far more options than people are accustomed to that offer some of this lower budget, small team friendly way of working. I'm sure that there are some drawbacks. They probably are less feature rich than some of the 10 times more expensive options. But it does sound like it's a far more tenable proposition if you are a little bit more open-minded with some of your vendors. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it's safe to say that if you can get by with something that's more in the space of having basic features, or even maybe, I don't know if we want to use like silver and gold and platinum and titanium, some sort of scoring like that, maybe it's the gold package. And if you can figure out whether the gold package could work for you, it would be an option then to use these types of systems. If you need all those bells and whistles because there is this expectation of complex reporting and at your fingertips at a moment's notice, you need to do that type of reporting, then it may not be feasible to necessarily build everything yourself. But that's where the hybrid, the figuring out, okay, for this piece, we do need to spend maybe a little more. We do need to work with a partner, but we just need one or two partners instead of a full service CRO, for instance, company to provide all of the services. So you basically can take a step back and figure out where's the area where we want all the bells and whistles. What if we just confined the extra spend to that area? And then we figure out how to do something more in the configuration space that would have come at a potentially lower price tag and be more affordable. So you could use some of those extra dollars to then find the team members to come on board and execute the study.
Oh, that's actually an interesting perspective. I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention that if you're clever about your software vendor partners, you can use that to hire better staff internally. I don't know if I actually hear people make that trade-off or at least verbalize it. Let's say that's on the systems side of things. How about quality, work items, SOPs? How does that factor in and how should people be thinking about that if they make this decision?
There. So early in my career, I had the opportunity to actually move into quality. And my pet project, for lack of a better term, was to be the SOP coordinator. And because I actually did that, I had to work with the functions for any new SOPs that they wanted, any periodic review of existing SOPs. And I also served on a process mapping team. So because I did that early in my career, I now understand how to write documents that fit within the quality management system so that the company will be set up, hopefully, to succeed when there's an inspection. I realize now, and I think sometimes I forget that that was a pretty unique opportunity that I actually had. And there are maybe not a lot of individuals in the industry that had the opportunity to go into quality, call it an internship. It wasn't an internship, but the amount of time you could say it was like an internship, but really spend that time boots on the ground doing that activity. There still are several companies available that could actually help a company, a sponsor company, let's say, that's going to build their own team, create those SOPs that would be fit for purpose for how they're going to operate. So even if a team member within the company doesn't necessarily have that expertise, they could hire for just a small project to help produce it. Now, I have had individuals say, oh, SOP projects never go really well. They can be very difficult because the team member doesn't really understand how the company functions and there's no way to actually help them function. Yes, I would say I think there is a way to do so. The question would be, can you wrap your brain around allowing someone to come in and
Mm-hmm.
spend a bit of time just observing
Mm-hmm.
to see how things flow, because they would need a little bit of that to go write something that would work for that company. So it's just thinking of their presence in a different way
Right.
because they need to be there in order to effectively document the
Right.
procedures.
Asking leadership to be patient and give a little bit of time seems like in and of itself a daunting task for someone who's thinking about doing this. How is that conversation? Like, what is the change management framework that, people should go into when they have this? Because I can imagine that, especially at some of the smaller organizations, if you go in and say to your leadership, hey, actually, I think we should bring in some of these functions in house, or we're going to kind of manage them, their board might say, whoa, this sounds like a risky bet. Why are we doing this? Isn't that isn't that what a CRO is for?
I think that my perspective of what kicks off change management is really making sure there's understanding. So there's
Hmm.
the saying, the desire should be to understand rather than to be understood. The idea is, are you able to convey the information in a way that will help the leadership understand this is what optimal would look like if we had X amount of dollars to apply to optimal? Here is a model that can be used to get us as close to the outcome of that optimal model, right? What that model would produce. And here are the trade-offs. I think when you're talking to leadership, you can't sell perfection. And what I mean by perfection is, oh, this isn't different than that. They have the exact same. No, no, no. You can't
Hmm.
say they'll have the exact same outcome. You have to be
Right.
able to say, here are the pros and cons of this model. Here are the pros and cons of this model. When you look at them together, here are the trade-offs that you would need to consider if we go this route. And then, of course, here are the potential risks. That, I think, is speaking the language of leadership. Leadership always wants to do something within budget. That's always important to them. They always want to make sure it's high quality. So just saying, oh, it'll be within budget and oh, it'll be high quality, that's expected. It's really going beyond and helping them understand what the day to day would look like
Mhm.
and how you could react if something went wrong. Because with the CRO, because they have, for instance, the infrastructure from a personnel perspective, generally from a finance perspective, there are all of these things. They have a full quality management system. They already have that established. It brings a lot of comfort. So what you're trying to do is say, we can achieve the same level of comfort, but it is not going to look that way immediately. We have to build it and we know what we need to build to. And so here's what everything is going to look like. Here's the timing of it. Here's what we will pay for it. And at the end of the day, we always have a fail-safe, and everyone has this. You always have a rescue plan. If this doesn't work out, here's my contingency. Here's what I would fall back on. So it's really speaking a language that gives them a level of assurance that you've thought it through and you haven't just thought about it from the perspective of success.
Mhm.
You've also thought about the failures along the way and how you would potentially react to those failures.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Leadership and budgets, always a question. What is the fact or fiction here? When you read online about moving towards kind of either hybrid models or fully in or something in between, but something that is not traditionally FSO, obviously budget is a huge topic or concern. But then the other question is whether or not it's actually cheaper. After you put everything together with the total comp of hires, the infrastructure, and everything else like that, how should one think about what that end state might look like?
I think that it is a financial planning and analysis exercise to show
Hmm.
that it would actually be cheaper. Generally, with smaller companies, sometimes they don't even have full financial planning and analysis, like a forecast of the spend that isn't straight lined, where it's just kind of like, okay, each month it's about this amount, where they
Right.
really have looked at, oh, all of these are upfront payments. So that means we're going to get hit with these upfront payments. Then it'll be straight line for this amount of time. And then there's going to be a spike again in the payments. A lot of times, smaller companies don't have that level of detail available to them. So I think what needs to happen is whatever the model is that they're using financially, you need to be able to create that same model for them based on your alternative approach, and help them understand that you may not really see the savings until the end necessarily, because typically there's still going to be a lot of upfront commitment, but overall you might save 20%. So what's the cutoff from a leadership perspective? Is 20% decent?
Right.
Well, are they saying, oh, for 20%, we'll just go with what's tried and true, or 20% could actually help us from a business perspective when we're looking at our cash runway? 20% can actually get us to here. If you can guarantee this, then we'll approve it. It really boils down to understanding the drivers from a
Right.
business perspective, and how to create a story that factors in those drivers. If you just go in and it's really great and everything you share makes a lot of sense, but you don't connect it to the spend, there's nothing for them to actually react to. So somehow showing how the money is going out the door, and then how much after the fact would have gone out the door.
Right.
Those two matter.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that when leaders, especially on the operations side, want to have this conversation, it's probably for them much more a question of control and quality. But when you're going to your leadership, they may not be aware of all of the intimate details of the day-to-day execution. And so for them, it ultimately does become a dollars and cents kind of question, right? But it sounds like one of the necessary skills you have to have, amongst other things, is sophisticated financial planning and analysis if you want to undergo this. You also had mentioned some kind of either background in quality or awareness that there are organizations which will help you with some of this quality development. Are there other internal skills or personal skills as it relates to the kind of leader who is driving this initiative they should have to kind of even begin to embark on this journey? Like, what are the skills that they need to have either in place or be aware of if they want to make this decision at all?
I would say one of the key things is, do you recognize what you don't know? And do you already have a technique in place for yourself to support what you don't know? So what I mean by that is, are you confident, secure enough to say, I don't know this space, but I have a network and I can connect with my network, and I'm willing to either bring someone in or have them teach me. I don't know what to call that skill necessarily, but I think that is a significant thing that leaders need, because when you're embarking upon something that maybe hasn't been done that frequently, or maybe hasn't been done specifically in the therapeutic area you're in, it's already daunting. And so if you're thinking you have to be the end all for it, and you can see gaps in your own knowledge or gaps in your own experience or your skill set, may cause someone to say, I don't want to take that chance. But if you have a way to fill those gaps, you can take the chance. So to me, are you capable of building things? Maybe that's the skill. Are you a skilled builder? But
Interesting. Was this skill map exercise part of the leadership conversation? So you had mentioned one of the things that you talk about is kind of how the cash flow ends up playing out, but is another part of it saying, look, here's what the team has right now, here's what we don't know that we don't have, and here's what we think we have, or here's what we think we need to know. Was that also part of that conversation?
It's definitely showing them the complete picture. So it's not a complete picture if you don't give them a sense of what you would need to supplement, right? How you would need to supplement the team and what your plans are for said supplementation. So if you come to the table like, I know it all, I've got it all in hand, who's going to believe it? not too many people would believe it. But if you come to the table saying, here's everything that I know, here are the areas that I don't know, but I've worked with several people that do know those areas and they consult. And so I would be bringing them on board, like tell them the story, set up the picture. So it's very clear what, who, when, how, like all of the questions, you thought through them and you're ready to actually answer them and transparently answer them with, it's not me, but I have someone who it is, or I have someone in my network. But if you have someone in your network that you'd prefer that we work with,
Right.
can you introduce me? I just know these are the places where we need those people. That should be part of that presentation, and is being able to just be transparent about what you know, what you don't know. I think it goes a long way. I think that sometimes people see that as showing your weaknesses, and you never want to show your weaknesses. And I think it's worse, or maybe it's better to say you don't want to tell people what your weaknesses are. I think it's worse to show your weakness. Because now, even though you might be weak in a single area, what may happen is they will begin to think you're just weak, especially if something goes off really poorly in that area. It's like it automatically is difficult to still see all the good that you did because this thing is just so glaring. So I recommend that leaders be extremely transparent about what you don't know. Just have a solution for what you don't.
Good communication is always a very important skill, no matter what you're doing and no matter what endeavor you're embarking on. One thing that you had mentioned as part of the financial planning, I just wanted to touch on as it just occurred to me, is that especially with some of the smaller biotechs, your capital may be tied to certain milestones. Was that part of the conversation at all when you had to talk about how certain things were going to have greater upfront costs, but ultimately would be, perhaps 20% cheaper by the end? Did that factor into the analysis at all?
It did and always does. It is typical that the full amount matters, and then the timing of that amount going out the door matters as well. And so if you already know the cash runway and you understand how to conduct a little bit of the analysis yourself, then you could even look at, I need to change certain things about my operations because there's no way we're going to be able to send all of this out of the door in the first quarter. So how then can I structure the operations so that this amount goes out in the first quarter? This amount can go out in the second quarter, and then we'll be in a good flow and everything will be pretty even thereafter. So it absolutely matters because you want to make sure if your operational model is the one that the company should be considering, that you've thought about how you can still fulfill your model, still use that model.
Right.
If you have to conserve cash for a little while. And so it all is intertwined.
I think the narrative about doing this has largely been from the operations side, right? We talk about how, it increases quality, increases control. You need to be both flexible. You also gain flexibility from doing this. And then we did mention a bit about the budget. But, alongside risk, are there reasons that the leadership should want to pursue this option outside of seeing this as a potentially, slightly cheaper option? Does it help them do their job with investors? Does it help them feel like they're de-risking it? Does it help them get to those milestones faster? What is the leadership's kind of benefit outside of saying, I'm glad that we have to raise a little bit less or that our runway is a little bit longer?
Well, one of the benefits is direct and immediate access to the data. So when you are doing it yourself, it's immediate. And everyone should understand that when you're working with a partner, that partner wants to be seen in the best light. So that means the partner is going to want everything that they send externally, right, to actually have gone through some quality control. What happens when you're doing it yourself is at 9 a.m., if the leadership team wants to see something, they can probably see it by 10 after 9. When you're working with a partner, if they want to see it at 9 a.m., you have to respect the partner's processes. And oftentimes it may be that you can't even see it until the next day. So if you have investors that are extremely anxious and they want to speak to you immediately, and you need to put them off a day or two or a week or two, some of that matters. So a lot of times leadership, they like to know that they can have immediate access, of course, with the understanding that it might have to go through some cleaning, but this is real time information that may not have gone through all of the quality control processes. That's one thing that leadership really, really likes, the real time access. The other thing is being able to change on a dime. So leaders are typically strategists. And oftentimes strategists will say at the beginning, okay, yeah, your strategy, fine, we'll go with that. It makes a lot of sense. But as things are happening out in the market, maybe they were at a conference. Anyway, something comes across their desk and it's making them think differently. And so they now want to pressure test the original strategy that they put in place and see if they can augment it. Oftentimes, when you're running the operations yourself, you can have those discussions quite quickly and get some of those answers quite quickly. If you're not, when you're working with a partner, once again, you have to respect the partner's process. And so first, because the partner isn't at every table with you and in a lot of rooms with you, it does take time for you to convey your expectations and for the partner to confirm, okay, I think we clearly understand the requirements. We're clear on our side. Now we can go do the following and get back to you. I think the biggest thing is whatever you're trying to do, you can pretty much often do much, much faster when you're doing it yourself than you can do when you're working with a partner. So speed matters, is a big driver.
Interesting. From the abstract, completely makes sense. But for perhaps the lay viewer such as myself, what is an example of a, agile strategic change that is better handled when you're doing it yourself versus when you have to coordinate with partners?
I can give you an example. So on one of the studies that I was working on or leading, there was a competitor, and it looked like the competitor was potentially going to make it to the next stage well before us. And at the outset, seemingly that actually didn't matter. Well, as things began to progress, there was something that was happening in the market that pretty much let the leadership team know, okay, this competitor is pretty serious, but if they get out ahead of us, they're going to have the market share for this amount of time. And because there's already an amount of market share that was with existing products, it meant even less that would be available to us. So the original time frame was accelerated because this competitor, where I think it was thought that their product might not actually work as well, had good data. So because of that, the question was posed, what can we do to catch up and potentially speed past them? And with our partner at the time, we were hearing a lot of, it would take this long before we would know this. It would take this long before we would know that. We would need to put this in place, and it takes currently this amount of time for us to put this in place. When I was asked if we did this ourselves, how long would it take? I was able to tell them, oh, not as long. And here's why. We don't have any of this in our quality management system. It's currently sitting in our partner's quality management system. We could actually design our SOPs to say the following. It doesn't require as many steps as they require. And there's nothing that says we have to go through all of those steps. The reason our partner has to go through all of those steps is because they serve many different companies. So they have to standardize their approach. We can tailor our approach. In hearing that, it was, okay, we need to accelerate things. You need to go make this happen. Will it cost us more money? So then I had to go and do that analysis and say, here's how we can move things around that already exist. Here's the price tag for it. But then they took that back and they looked at the operating budget and they said, that's not a problem, because if we finish this here, then it moves all of this to here. And so there is actually a benefit to us being able to do it faster.
Wow, that is a complete narrative buster, what you just said right there. First, it's flexibility, control, budget, and now you're saying that you might even hit your milestones faster in certain cases when your infrastructure, which I'm, including SOPs and QMS in there, is fit for purpose for your organization and your study. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that.
Being in quality, I was working at a company that had multiple products, and those products were at different stages. And so we had to have SOPs that fit the different stages of development for those products and also the different therapeutic areas. And so when you're writing from that perspective, some of what you put in place might be incredibly beneficial for early phase, let's say, and incredibly beneficial for particular therapeutic areas. But it could be really restrictive in late stage or other therapeutic areas. As a company, if you're constantly tailoring what you're doing to the individual study that you may be working on, right? Then now you have these SOPs and you have to make sure that you comply with the SOPs. So are you writing a whole bunch of deviations to the SOPs? So then if your SOPs are not fit for purpose, is your quality management system fit for purpose? So what begins to happen is the ability to tailor to something specific calls into question your quality management system when really it shouldn't. The system
Right.
probably is fine as it is, but a company is going to have to take a step back and say, if we have to go through all of these, like this bending and twisting and turning to make this happen, maybe we shouldn't be working on this particular thing. When you do it yourself, you're invested in the success of your singular product or maybe
Mhm.
two of your products. And you're trying to figure out how to get to the end with those two products. That means that you're really not backed into the corner when it comes to, oh, what about all these other things, in a way that you would be if you're working with a partner that has a well-established, proven quality management system, but also that comes with longer time frames to turn things around, systems and processes that you have to follow, which keep you from being able to maybe adapt something. And that adaptation is not against any regulations, not against any guidances. That adaptation would be 100% fine. But if you're constantly adapting your quality management system, then the question is, do you really have a quality management system in place?
Right. That makes sense. We're interestingly on the eve of the recent finalization on R3. So I think it's an interesting time to ask, how do the recent changes, if at all, apply to, fit for purpose and quality by design when you're taking your QMS in-house?
Well, I think the guidance has always basically explained that you need to define what you're doing. And what you're doing when you define it, just make sure you've considered these things. That's the way I think about ICH.
Mhm.
So, what is your vendor management paradigm? Does that mean that vendor management wasn't something that should have been done 20 years ago? No, it should have always been done 20 years ago. The issue was because it wasn't expressly stated, companies weren't really thinking, oh, let's write that down. Let's have that clearly
Mhm.
explained or clearly defined. So some of what the updates have done is help people understand, oh, these are the areas where we should really have this defined. Okay, no problem. And when you're defining it, just make sure you touch on these few things. Make sure those things are clear. I think with anything, we learn and there's always this continuous learning. And so as you're learning, you should be going back and looking at, is there something I need to be writing differently so that everyone understands? You should be thinking about this thing in this manner, and you should be making sure that whatever you're doing associated with that, you can prove that you did it. So you need to have some documentation that shows, yes, this was done. I think when we get these new updates, they're doing nothing more than helping us understand, define these things. It's going to make you stronger. It's going to make your quality management system stronger. It's actually going to make your work product, whatever you're producing, should be better.
We talked a little bit about how there are certain steps which, when applied to perhaps a broad basket of studies, is consistent, but then, for your specific study or your specific product may not make sense. And being able to not have to apply those steps is useful. Are there concrete examples that one might be able to kind of think through or reason as to which ones can be removed? Or do you have like examples just to make it a little bit more concrete?
Sometimes when you work with companies, and this can be in sponsor companies, it's not just CROs. Sometimes the way the quality management system is written, it says the what. So in your standard operating procedure, you have both defined the what and the how. And let's say in the how section, you say a document needs to go through 4 levels of review. Those 4 levels of review are level A, which includes these people, level B, which includes these people, level C, which includes these people and this timing, and level D, which finishes with all comments resolved and a quality check.
Right.
So that's what the SOP says. That probably came from something that happened in the past where they thought we need to define this, we need to be much clearer, right? What I am actually proposing is, one, not being so locked in to something like that. And typically when you're smaller, you can write your procedures so they're not being that specific, because you may not even have enough infrastructure to support it.
Right.
So that you write the procedures in a manner that it allows you to figure out which how you're going to apply, but you're very specific about the what. So there needs to be a draft, there needs to be a review cycle for the draft, and there needs to be a final QC. How you conduct those is variable.
Right.
But you need to be able to document there was a draft, it went through this step, and it went through this step. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about when you work with a partner that has well-defined, well-established procedures. It's often because they have this infrastructure that lends to following that procedure. If you don't have that same infrastructure and you build procedures that way, the moment you can't do one of those steps, you now aren't complying with your own procedure. Once you don't comply with your own procedure enough, it doesn't matter if your data looks great. You didn't follow your own QMS. How do we know you didn't do something with that data to make it look that great? That's what happens at the end. So what I would say is it's dependent upon your partner, and it's dependent upon how your partner has everything set up. If your partner requires, for instance, a kickoff meeting, and it's a requirement, and you don't do that kickoff meeting, deviation. Let's say there are a few things that you wind up not doing. That's deviation on top of deviation on top of deviation. Now what you're calling into question is, when you step outside of your QMS, how do you make sure the things that would have happened in that activity actually happened? You have that there for a reason. How do we know that you replicated all of those steps when you didn't follow that plan or that process? Did that answer your question?
It did. It makes sense. Yeah. Every organization is going to have a very different administrative cycle time when it comes to quality, and probably a host of other things. And those are going to be fit for purpose for that organization. And sometimes smaller organizations who are more focused can move faster when their own processes are fit for their own organizations. Right. And in the, in almost a tautologically true case, right, a 4-level review system may not even apply to an organization that's relatively flat. How could it possibly be faster than a flat organization model, right? So, no, that makes sense. Are there other areas you found which are what I'll call maybe milestone boosters? So we talked about quality or maybe SOP development. Are there other areas where you found? Because in particular, I can imagine there would be a huge pushback around just study startup in general, right? That seems incredibly daunting, even just hearing it and thinking about it. How's that been?
So study startup, what's interesting is if you are a smaller company and you're doing startup manually, that's probably going to burn all your resources. They're not going to really have the time that they need to make sure your database was set up the way your database should be set up, as an example. But if that smaller organization is able to use a CTMS that could be set up via a wizard, and all of the tracking information is really at their fingertips. So how to actually track it, what needs to be tracked, it's fed to them. So it really keeps them on track, if you will. That's not as daunting. What's daunting about that is really influencing the sites to do what they're supposed to do. Believe it or not, the biggest part of clinical trial execution is influencing our external stakeholders, the sites, to actually give enough time and attention to the study when they have so many other responsibilities that they have at the site. So what really we should be focusing on is how can we make our operations straightforward and streamlined enough that it's not so difficult for the sites to actually perform the functions they need to perform. And it will almost be a breath of fresh air for them when they shift to the study to say, oh, I have to work on this study today. Oh, this is the easy one. No studies are easy, but
Right.
the easy one means this is the one that's a lot easier than the others. That, I think, is what doing it yourself, it enables you to really work with the sites to get to that place, to get to the place where you have enough input from the sites that you can create an environment that's associated with your trial that is easier for them. And sometimes when you're doing it yourself, you can't build enough infrastructure that it winds up being easier for them. So that's another, jumping back to me starting with the risk, that's another risk where it's, do you not have enough infrastructure to make the job a little easier on the sites? We want the sites to focus on patient care, but we know that there's all this extra documentation that they have to do around this patient care. How can we make it not so difficult, not so, maybe to decrease the volume some? So it's not a lot of, dare I say, unnecessary information that doesn't really ultimately get analyzed. These are the things that when you're working with your own team, you're having these kinds of discussions and they just happen. They just come up organically in a meeting, in a setting. And that can't always happen when you have a partner where you're trying to schedule a time and then that time doesn't work for this clinical development team member. So you don't really get to have just these natural interactions that can happen in real time like that, but can wind up having a significant impact on everyone's experience of your trial.
Interesting. And that's not really just startup. That's the entire life cycle of the study with your site partners, right?
That's correct.
There was an interesting report that came out fairly recently, I think, and it was by McKinsey, and it was talking about, or it was relating study success and milestones with site experience scores as it pertains to the study. So put simply, it's how the site feel about your study impact your study's ability to succeed? And it was pretty obvious, at least from the data that they collected, and full transparency, I didn't really dive into it. So, take it with a grain of salt until you read it yourself. But at least it showed that, sites that have better experience scores tend to produce have studies with better sites experiences tend to have better outcomes. It sounds like, at least for someone who may be in similar position, considering these kinds of options of taking certain things in Insource, the pro and the con, as it seems to be across a variety of areas, is the con. I'll start from the con and just make sure I understand what you're saying. The con is, if you do not have the right infrastructure to support your site partners, that experience could be much worse for them. And going off of what I just said, that could harm your study, right? However, on the flip side, assuming you have infrastructure, insourcing gives you the flexibility to be reactive, such that things that you can do to improve the study for your site partners is something you can act on immediately. And those effects can be felt immediately, as opposed to going through the entire cycle of first working with your partners to identify what the changes are, seeing if they're accepting of those changes in the first place, and then having to go through their own internal, let's just call it the cycle, their administrative cycle time. So that's kind of that's the pro, is that you can move on a lot faster. Is that correct?
That's the pro. Also, it's really not just that you can move on a lot faster, it's that you are incentivized to do so as well. One of the other things is when it's your partner has to look at the impact, what they need, what we need them to do for our study will have across the rest of their organization. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I don't have to think about. I'm thinking about, this would work. Right. Looks like this might be really useful across all of our sites. If we implemented this, maybe we would see some of these other things change. Maybe the response times for the sites would pick up because this thing is less burdensome to them. Maybe it's that they feel heard. And because they feel heard, it's like, okay, I can speak up more. Like, I am truly a partner in this. Right. I'm not just dumped on, go get this done, get this data entered. You have 3 days, you have 5 days. It really is that we see value in the partnership. And it's not to say that our service provider partners don't see the value. It's that they see the value through a different lens, and they have to think in those terms.
Right.
And we ought to understand that as well. We should understand that they have to think in those terms as well. And so it's this, what's the trade-off?
Right. No, that makes sense. I think it's very common for people to speak on things as if the incentives are completely maligned, as if they're almost an antagonist to you, even though they're your vendor partner. When the reality is, it's just that for you, your entire staff, everyone is aligned and their incentives are structured such that every single KPI, every single work that you're doing moves your study forward. But
Yes.
with your vendor partners, you are one of many studies that they have to move forward, and everyone's time is finite. And so it's not that they're not working their hardest, it's that their hardest is still going to be split between however many other things that they have to do, both on your study, administrative, internal work, etc. Right.
Right. And the other way of thinking of it as well is, say you're in a situation where you need to have team members available at 5 a.m. and also at 11 p.m. Can you imagine if you needed to have team members available from 5 a.m. all the way through to 11 p.m. Eastern time, and they need to be like pretty much in the Eastern time zone because that same thing needs to be repeated in each time zone. So that's what you need. Can you imagine going to a partner saying, I need to have this, and I really need it to be like these people, and I can't have them switch out and swap out because these are the people that actually understand and know. So it has to be them. Well, now you're in a fully dedicated model. So if you're in a fully dedicated model with your partner, then it's only going to boil down to, will their SOPs allow the things that you need them to do? So now you're getting back into, are they able to follow their SOPs? When you start thinking about the complexity of these kinds of things, where this group of the partner staff needs to learn a completely different way of operating specific to this particular study, and they need to be available these extended hours, does that seem feasible, reasonable? At the end of the day, it probably doesn't. When it's your asset, you'll figure out how to make that happen. And you get the
Interesting.
buy-in from your team members who want
Right.
to see it succeed. So
Right.
they're just like, I'm here for it. I'll do it.
You know, I hadn't considered this, but now that you're mentioning it, I wonder if some of the rise in FSP and insourcing can be because of the fact that overall as an industry we tend to move away from small molecules and towards cell and gene therapy and other biologics, which by nature have more complex study designs, right? And so it necessitates people doing things that are really not, the SOPs are not really fit for purpose, especially organizations that have been around for a super long time, right? Everyone's working certain hours in certain ways. I suppose if you're trying to monitor the shipment of something across different time zones, or making sure it arrives on time, or you particularly fickle temperature variability, you have all of these other factors to consider. And at that point in time, yeah, I guess it would make sense to kind of just have a person dedicated who really, really understands what you're trying to do. So it makes sense that incentives are aligned, and it makes sense that you would need infrastructure. However, I imagine that there are other considerations which would either make this a no-go option or a go option. And this is just how would geography perhaps affect this, or maybe site lists? For example, if you are now trying to run a much larger study, how much confidence do you need to have internally with your team that you're able to kind of even get these sites online to get, power your study with the number of patients? Kind of what are other kind of major factors that would you consider?
Well, just like manufacturing has this scale up process, you do have to scale your operations with whatever the size of your trials, right? So your operations definitely need to match. As far as geography, depending on where you're going to be, yes, it's probably wise to have a footprint in those areas. So if you are just operating in North America, you can probably really just focus on having a team member or two in each time zone. But if you're going to be global, generally speaking, you will have partners anyway. You will find a partner in a given country, or like say in the EU, a partner that could serve many of the countries or cover many of the countries. But the idea is the scale needs to make sense. So you need to scale your operations to whatever you're doing from an execution perspective, the size of your trial, the location of your trial. But something that I should have mentioned that I didn't, which is not related to geography specifically, it is the general administration team. So in a given company, if you now are going to insource, that means that you need to have some legal probably headcount there. Maybe you could have one legal headcount for a while and some consultants, but you're definitely going to have to scale your HR, your human resources team, your finance team. And even if you only build it with contractors at first, consultants at first, you still need to have additional resources to help with some of that compliance that comes into play. From a finance perspective, along with HR, just payroll itself changes. Where you're now going to be represented state-wise, depending on where your employees are. There's all this local, right, state and local county, those type of compliance issues come into play. That scaling is generally speaking what smaller companies don't want to do. They don't want to have a lot of headcount in that area because to them it's drawing from, like pulling out of, the revenue, or I might be using the wrong term there, but they're not increasing your profit or even the potential for your profit. That's not how it's thought of. I think of it that way because they're going to make sure that you have the infrastructure that you need from a human resources perspective, and you have whatever the programs are that you need to have in place and the various trainings. That's what they do. But when you just boil it down to the dollars and cents of it, a lot of times leadership will be like, what are we really getting from that?
Mhm.
So that is another that would go for some in the con column. And what I would say about that is it just depends on how you solve that issue.
Right.
It's not necessarily a con. It's how you go about addressing that particular issue. You can turn that con into a pro.
I see. No, it definitely makes sense, right? You just mentioned time zones, and as it stands, you're not going to have people operating in different time zones if they're probably not living in those time zones. I think one thing that might be to the benefit, or at least in the pro category there, is just HR software and hiring remotely has become so much easier now. If we were talking about this 10 years ago, you'd have to hire like a state specific person and they'd have to go through all of this rigmarole and so on. There's so many companies that have made remote hiring post COVID easier that I actually think that is probably far less a concern now than it ever was in the past, especially when you consider like both the HR components, the legal components, and the financial components. So that's definitely an interesting portion that I hadn't considered.
I will say that some individuals working in that area might not necessarily agree with your assessment, but I hear you.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's fair. I think like all things, there's like the broad market where people feel pretty good about it, and then the consummate professionals like, but there's nuance, and there's this, and it's always true, but always, not true. All right. Well, is there any other things that an interested head of clinical operations may want to consider for themselves before making this decision? I think we've covered a lot, but I guess final question, is there anything else we've missed?
I don't think we missed it, but just to expound on it, I think it's important to look at networks. For a lot of professionals, they have a vast network, and it's really figuring out who within your network is a potential resource that you could actually call upon. Maybe look at them different than you looked at them previously. Sometimes it seems like such a daunting task to do it yourself because the thinking is everything would be on your back. But if you have some colleagues that you've established a really solid rapport with, even if they aren't able to be the point of contact for you, they have a network. So you never know who they may know that they could connect you with. And if you trust them with their referral, you still get to vet the person and see if it seem like this person could potentially help you or not. I would say individuals don't necessarily do this enough, where they take a little bit of time, use some of that mental space, and think about who they're connected to, what they know. Maybe you're willing to do it yourself. You just need someone to help guide you. Really think about how you can make your large network smaller by chopping that network up into, oh, they could potentially help me if I decided to try to do things myself. Or maybe they have a company that they're working with that could actually help if I want to do it myself. It may not be as hard as people think it is.
Right.
They might actually have access to a lot of resources that could actually help them build it. And don't discount that it could be a full service CRO partner that could provide part of those services as well.
Right. Not only are you not alone, but there's probably far more flexibility than you imagine. Right. So
That's
that's
right.
a good point. All right. Well, Is there anything you'd like the audience to know, and where can they find you?
I would say I'd like the audience to know that there are some individuals in the industry that really want to help others, like seriously. For me, I'm one of them. Someone helped me very early in my career, and I thought about wanting to also give back myself. And so I didn't think I needed to wait until I was a certain level. I started doing it immediately, willing to help in any way, shape, or form. But I do have an email address where you contact me to ask any questions. I'm willing to help. It's really about just educating those that are eager to do right by their company. They want to comply with the regulations. They want to do a good job. They may just be looking to get a quick answer. I'm willing to be that person to give you a quick answer and maybe to connect you with others that could help you as well.
Ooh, first step reliance on network. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sharita, for your time. And further information will be in the description and show notes. Thank you very
Perfect.
much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Trial and Error. Remember, every step forward in clinical research brings us closer to the next medical breakthrough. Our goal is to spread knowledge and improve the chance that life-saving drugs make it to market. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider rating us or giving us a review, as that really helps other listeners find the podcast. Most importantly, though, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach out directly and say hello.